Hello, this is Al Getz, bringing you the event center for Jim Crockett Promotions in 1971 from Charting the Territories. For more information on Jim Crockett Promotions in 1971, be sure to visit chartingtheterritories.com, where you can see A Year in the Life, the most in-depth look at a year in the life of a wrestling territory you'll find anywhere. Now, on this event center, we're going to look at a sample week for Jim Crockett Promotions. And typically on these event centers, we pick a mostly complete but not quite complete week where our research shows that we're missing some house shows. And we use the data that we have to sort of prove what we're missing. In this case, we have what is a complete week worth of house shows for Crockett in 1971. Typically, the promotion would run 3 separate crews most nights during the week. As a general rule of thumb in the early 1970s, they did not run house shows on Sundays, and this is pretty common in the time period, particularly in the southern U.S. Because of these so-called blue laws. A lot of promotions were actually unable to run on Sundays, and in some cases they just decided to have one day off, which of course goes against what we generally believed to be the case, where wrestlers would always claim they worked 7 days a week and twice on Sundays. At least through the mid-70s, a lot of them did not work on Sundays, and that seems to be the case here for Crockett. But you'll notice that we said they typically ran 3 house shows a night. You'll see here in what we believe to be a complete week, on Tuesdays there were only 2 house shows, and on Wednesday there was only 1 house show. And looking through the calendar for the entire year, this was always the case. There was never a week with more than 2 house shows run on a Tuesday, and there was never a week with more than 1 house show run on a Wednesday. Now, taking into account some other things I know about Crockett at the time, how they did their TV tapings, this sort of gave me some clues. They would do 3 TV tapings every week, 1 on Tuesdays in High Point, North Carolina, and 2 on Wednesdays, 1 in Charlotte and 1 in Raleigh. So even though we generally believe that when wrestlers worked TV, that was in addition to a house show that same day, here there seems to be some evidence that they might not have been the case, given the consistency with always having 2 house shows on Tuesdays and 1 on Wednesdays. So I actually reached out to a wrestler who was here in 1971, and that was Les Thatcher, and I asked him on Twitter what his recollections were of their taping schedule in 1971, and if when a wrestler worked TV, did they also work a house show that night? And he responded, TV was the only booking for that day in the Carolinas. So that seems to answer our question. When wrestlers would work a TV taping, that would be the only time they worked that particular day of the week. So if they're working in High Point on Tuesday, they wouldn't be booked for a house show in Columbia or Raleigh. And if they worked either of the TVs on Wednesday, they wouldn't be booked on the house show generally in Asheville that night. So knowing that, we now can safely say that this week, with a total of 15 house shows, Monday through Saturday, is a complete week. And also using that information, we can also estimate the total number of house shows that Crockett ran during the year. If 15 house shows a week was their maximum, and that's typically what they ran each and every week, well, 15 times 52 would be 780. However, this promotion did take 1 week off during the leading up to Christmas. From year to year, the amount of time they took off for the holidays differed. It was generally somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks based on how the calendar fell and what day of the week Christmas Eve, Christmas and New Year's Eve and New Year's typically were. But this week it was 1 week off. So that would bring the number down to about 765. In addition, when they ran larger venues several times a year, and we're talking about Greensboro, which I think they ran 10 or 11 times during the year, Winston-Salem, which was run twice, and a couple of times during the year they ran a larger venue in Charlotte, the Coliseum. Most of the time, those cards were very loaded. It wasn't just 1/3 of the crew. It was a much bigger crew, and typically Crockett would only run one other house show that night. So given there are somewhere in the vicinity of 15 nights where they were running one of those larger venues and probably only running 2 shows, we bring that number back down closer to 750. So our best estimate as to how many house shows JCP ran in 1971 was about 750. And our records, which include all the clippings compiled by the wonderful, fantastic folks at the Mid-Atlantic Gateway, and that's Dick Bourne, Dave Chappell, and Mark Eastridge. They were gracious enough to share all their clippings and records with me. So putting all that together, we had a total of 698 house shows documented. If we believe the actual number run was about 750, that means our records are about 92 to 93% complete. So now let's take a closer look at this sample week, looking at the lineups for all of the cards we have documented, all 15 of them. So first, Monday night in Charlotte, and you can see this was at their normal weekly venue, Park Center. The main event was a 6-man tag with Jack and Jerry Brisco teaming with Sandy Scott to face Missouri Mauler, Larry Hamilton, Brute Bernard, and Art Nelson. Also, the Von Steigers, Kurt and Carl, took on Bobby Paul and Matty Suzuki, and a little bit further down the card, George Grant versus Gene Anderson, and Johnny Heidman versus Bob Griffin. Also on Monday night in Fayetteville, the main event was a Argentine bola match, which is sometimes called a bolo match. It basically has the same rules as a leather strap match. Both wrestlers were tied together with a 6-foot leather strap. And this was Argentina Apollo versus Swede Hanson. Also a 6-man tag featuring Tommy Siegler, Les Thatcher, and Koatiki against Bill Bowman, Joe Turner, and Frank Morrell. And the 2 prelims were Abe Jacobs versus Pampero Firpo and Luther Lindsay versus Tony Romano. The third card on Monday night in Greenville, South Carolina was Johnny Weaver versus Rip Hawk with Hawk's manager Gary Hart handcuffed and Swede Hanson barred from the ring. Now you'll recall Hanson was actually booked in Fayetteville the same night, so even if he wanted to, he probably couldn't have made it to help out Rip in this main event. Also a tag team match with Frank Hester and Jim Dillon, and that is J.J. Dillon, against Rock Hunter and Joe Soto. The Fabulous Moolah versus Debbie Johnson, and the 2 prelims were Crusher Carlson versus Angelo Martinelli and Jesse James versus Tinker Todd. On Tuesday night in Columbia, main event was Rip Hawk and Swede Hanson against the Brisco brothers, Jack and Jerry. Also on the card, Sandy Scott took on Joe Turner, Abe Jacobs versus Johnny Heidman, Frank Morrell versus Frank Hester, and Tommy Siegler versus Tony Romano. The other card on Tuesday night was in Raleigh, and the main event was a lumberjack match with Brute Bernard, the Missouri Mauler, and Art Nelson versus Argentina Apollo, Tommy Siegler, and Johnny Weaver. And here you see Homer Odell is managing the heels. So you have Homer Odell managing Bernard, Mauler, and possibly Nelson, although I think he was primarily Brute and Mauler's manager. And you also had Gary Hart in the territory managing Rip Hawk and Swede Hanson. Now also on the card here, Gene Anderson versus Bobby Paul, Luther Lindsay versus Bill Bowman, and Bob Griffin versus Joe Soto. The one Wednesday night house show in Asheville, North Carolina, featured what was billed as a logger match, which in this territory was what they generally called a lumberjack match at this time. And this was Rock Hunter versus Pampero Firpo, with a special referee, Tommy Siegler. Also on the card, Koatiki and Matty Suzuki versus Turner and Bowman, Swede Hanson versus Jesse James, Tommy Siegler versus Frank Morrell, and Jim Dillon versus Crusher Carlson. The next night in Anderson, South Carolina, the main event was for the Eastern Heavyweight Championship, where champion Missouri Mauler defended against Argentina Apollo. Also Frank Hester and Bob Griffin versus Turner and Bowman, Brute Bernard versus Matty Suzuki, Fabulous Moolah versus Donna, what looks to be Barnes here, although I think previously she was billed as Debbie Johnson in other ads, so this may just have been a typo, although it's possible it was another wrestler, but I doubt it. And the opener was Koatiki versus Angelo Martinelli. Also on Thursday night, 6-man tag team action, and this one here, it's billed as a lumberjack match. So again, sometimes each city had their own little differences in what they called matches, but here it's a lumberjack match, whereas in Asheville it was called a logger match, but it's the same thing. And this was a 6-man tag with Hawk and Hanson teaming up with manager Gary Hart to face Jerry Brisco, Sandy Scott, and Jim Dillon. Also on the card, Bobby Paul versus Joe Soto, Bobby Williams versus Crusher Carlson, and Abe Jacobs versus Tony Romano. The third card on Thursday night was in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and it's the old Battle of the Bullies, which was what they called heel versus heel bouts. So here we have Art Nelson and Gene Anderson taking on the team of Rock Hunter and Pampero Firpo. And so here we see another example of kayfabe being what it is. In Asheville, the night before, Hunter and Firpo were facing one another. They had come into the territory as a team, but as Firpo was finishing up, the team split up. I don't think either of them turned babyface, although if one did, it would have been Pampero, but they were feuding in some towns, whereas in some others, when Firpo was finishing up, they would just keep them in tag matches, and presumably Pampero would do the honors on the way out. Also, another tag bout, the Von Steigers versus Tommy Siegler and Les Thatcher, Frank Morrell versus Jesse James, and Luther Lindsay versus Johnny Heidman. On Friday, one of the 3 house shows Friday night took place at Elon College with a Texas death match in the main event, Johnny Weaver taking on Art Nelson. Also on the card, Abe Jacobs and Luther Lindsay versus the Von Steigers, Gene Anderson versus Bob Griffin, and Jesse James versus Johnny Heidman, with the opener Crusher Carlson versus Angelo Martinelli. That same night in Lynchburg, Virginia, the Atlantic Coast Tag Team titles were on the line as champions Missouri Mauler and Brute Bernard took on Argentina Apollo and Tommy Siegler. So yes, that does mean that the Missouri Mauler was a double champion at this point in time. Also on the card, Frank Hester and Bobby Williams versus Tony Romano and Tinker Todd, Koatiki versus Bill Bowman, and Fabulous Moolah versus Debbie Johnson. The third card on Saturday night in Richmond, Virginia, Jerry Brisco and Sandy Scott versus Rip Hawk and Swede Hanson. A loser must leave the state match. One fall to an absolute finish. Firpo versus Hunter. Also on the card, Les Thatcher versus Joe Soto, Jim Dillon versus Joe Turner, and Matty Suzuki versus Bobby Paul. On Saturday, the first of 3 house shows we have on Saturday night, was a Texas death match with Firpo versus Hunter, the Von Steigers versus Thatcher and Dillon, the Fabulous Moolah versus Debbie Johnson, Jesse James versus George Grant, and Luther Lindsay versus Joe Soto. Also Saturday night, the 30th in Roanoke, Virginia, Rip Hawk and Swede Hanson took on Sandy Scott and Jerry Brisco. Now this little clip is a little misleading. It sort of insinuates that Gary Hart will be joining them for a 6-man tag. However, it was a tag match. It was just Hawk and Hanson, managed by Gary Hart, taking on Sandy and Jerry, who were managed for the night by Tommy Siegler. Also on the card, Turner and Bowman versus Suzuki and Paul, Siegler versus Frank Morrell, and Tinker Todd against Johnny Heidman. The third house show on Saturday night featured a main event of Johnny Weaver versus Art Nelson. Now here, you will notice that it states the lights will be out during this entire match. To the best of my knowledge, that wasn't the case. This match was billed as a lights out match. So perhaps the copywriter or the ad designer just took liberties with what he or she believed that meant. But in this territory at this time, what they called a lights out match was actually not what most wrestling fans think of when they hear the term lights out. This was actually a match contested with tape fists, and the match would continue until one man was knocked out, or I guess until they had their lights knocked out. So just another example of names of matches not always being what they think they are, what we think they are. We have the Lager match. We have the Argentine Bola match. We have this lights out match. In this territory, also at the time, they called a Texas Tornado tag team match. They actually called it a Texas Royal, which was when all 4 men would be in the ring at the same time. So again, just another little taste of territorial differences. Also on the card, Mauler and Bernard were taking on Frank Hester and Bob Griffin, plus other big matches. And of course, this being the night before Halloween, there was free trick-or-treat candy to children under 12 as long as it lasts. Oh man, if I had gone there as a 12-year-old, no matter when I got there, they would have been out of candy because I would have taken it all. But there you go. That's the 15 house shows that we have records for this week in Jim Crockett Promotions. And as I mentioned earlier, we believe this to be a complete week of house shows. Take another quick look at the map of the territory. In addition to showing you the calendar, here's how it all plays out on the map. You can see it's a pretty broad area stretching from South Carolina all the way up to halfway through Virginia. Depending on where wrestlers live, they could sort of manage their drive times. If they lived in Greensboro, which I think a fair amount of the crew may have done, none of the towns are more than 4.5-hour drive away. So if you do that, you can sort of, leave in the early afternoon, work the show, drive home afterwards, and be able to get a decent night's sleep before having to wake up the next day and do it all again. And of course, some wrestlers stayed over in whatever town they were in. It also depends on where they were the next night. They might not, they might be closer to the next town if they stayed over. And of course, we all know what sort of shenanigans they would get into if they stayed over in a hotel. But that's a story for another time. So let's take a look at this sample week as an Excel spreadsheet where I take all the wrestlers booked on any of these shows, divide them up by baby faces and heels, and also arrange them by their position on the cards, their average spot rating. So here we can see the left-hand side are the baby faces, the right-hand side are the heels. The darker shading for the first several rows are the main eventers, and then below that, the upper mid-carders, below that, the mid-carders, and then the very lightest shading is the preliminary wrestlers. Below them are the part-timers and special attractions. And for each day, I use abbreviations to show what town the wrestlers were booked in. So if we look at Johnny Weaver on the top left, on October 25th, he was booked in GRV, which stands for Greenville. Argentina Apollo was FAY for Fayetteville. Jerry Brisco was CHA for Charlotte, and so on and so forth. We also note when wrestlers were booked outside of the territory. Weaver, in fact, on Thursday, was booked in Amarillo for an appearance for the Funks territory, Western State Sports, so I abbreviated WTX for West Texas. And typically, when we put together this chart, we use the blank spaces to estimate what wrestlers would have been booked on the missing house shows. But as we established here, there are no missing house shows. So even though there are a lot of wrestlers unbooked on Tuesday, the 26th, those wrestlers, according to Les Thatcher, were almost certainly booked at the TV taping in High Point. And the same goes for Wednesday, where we're actually missing even more wrestlers because they only ran one house show. It is believed that the other wrestlers would have likely been booked on one of the two TV tapings that day, one in Charlotte and one in Raleigh. You can also see at the bottom of the left-hand side that Jack Brisco, who made 2 appearances on Monday and Tuesday, those were just him making a couple of cameo appearances. He was actually full-time in Florida at the time, and the rest of the week he was indeed booked in Florida. The other part-timer is Bobby Williams, who I believe was a police officer in Virginia, who also wrestled part-time. And then on the right-hand side, on the heel side, the only part-timer was the manager, Gary Hart, who was booked in that 1 6-man tag. And below them are the special attractions, which in this case were Moolah and Debbie Johnson. As I mentioned earlier, on one of the ads, she was listed as Debbie Barnes, but I think it was Debbie Johnson on all the cards. And here you also see that Moolah and Debbie were not booked on any of the house shows on Tuesday or Wednesday. And this could mean one of a couple of things. As I mentioned earlier, wrestlers who worked TV would be booked on house shows. So it's very possible that Moolah and Debbie worked TV on Tuesday or Wednesday, but it's also possible they just weren't booked, period. Now, typically, when the special attractions came to a territory, they'd be booked every single night consecutively for as long as they were in the territory. But in this case, that didn't need to happen because Moolah and her crew were based out of Columbia, South Carolina, which is one of Crockett's towns. So it's very possible that Moolah and Debbie were booked Monday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And on the off days, they just were back in Columbia. And then we can see on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the crew is pretty much fully booked up. George Grant, the babyface, is not booked on Thursday or Friday. And main eventer Argentina Apollo gets a rare night off on Saturday. And on the heel side, Tinker Todd is off Thursday. Frank Morrell is off Friday. And it looked like none of them are off Saturday. All the heels on the roster were booked up on Saturday. So here you see how the crew is pretty much used as much as possible. Some of the part-timers occasionally get 1 or 2 nights off during the week. And in this case, one of the main eventers got a rare night off. Also, Johnny Weaver got a night off, although he was wrestling in Amarillo at the time. So there you have it for Jim Crockett Promotions in 1971 in the Event Center. Hope you learned a little bit from this. And if you want to learn more about JCP in 1971, check out chartingtheterritories.com. Also, be sure to listen to our monthly podcast, Charting the Territories. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, pretty much anywhere you get your favorite wrestling podcasts. For Charting the Territories, this is Al Getz. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening.